My name is April. I'm 13 now, and this past year was the worst one I could ever imagine. My beloved Granny died. But before that, she scared me to death and managed to ruin my parents' marriage. Unfortunately, it just so happened that on the day I was born, my grandfather, my dad's dad, passed away. My parents immediately took my granny to live with us, and in fact, she was the one who brought me up while my mom and dad were busy at work. I loved my granny. She's always been very calm and kind, and we did so much stuff together, like baking things or making crafts for school, and so on. But she never ever yelled at me, even when I was misbehaving. From time to time, I saw that she was sad because she was missing my grandpa. And we could just sit for hours looking through their old photos, and she'd tell me lots of funny stories about him. Strange things began happening with Granny when I was 12. I came back from school having gotten a low grade for my math test. I was very upset, and I knew that even if Granny didn't get mad about it, she'd force me to study extra math that day. And I really hated numbers. I found her in the living room dusting the furniture, and as soon as she heard my bad news, she just grabbed the nearest vase to her and threw it at me. Thank God she missed and hit the wall, and the vase shattered. I didn't even immediately realize what had happened. Then suddenly, my granny began yelling at me that I was to be blamed for everything and that I should immediately get out and go to my room and stay there, and not even show my face downstairs. At that, her eyes sparkled with anger and her hands clenched into fists. I grabbed my backpack and rushed upstairs, sobbing on the way. Never before had I encountered aggression at home, and even more, I never even saw my sweet granny this furious. It was terribly insulting and scary. I sobbed in my room for about half an hour, and then I realized that I was hungry. Very carefully, I decided to go downstairs to make myself a sandwich. And I was so worried that Granny was still in that terrible mood down there. This time, she was in the kitchen cooking something for dinner, as if nothing had happened earlier. As soon as she saw me, she was genuinely surprised, because, as she said, she didn't even notice that I had gotten home from school. It was so shocking. I just stood there in complete bewilderment while my granny, in her most ordinary friendly manner, was fussing with silverware and setting the table to feed me dinner. Very carefully, I sat down at the table, peering into my granny's face, trying to understand if she was joking about not having noticed me or not. This time, she really seemed like a different person. I mean, she didn't resemble that furious old lady who threw a vase at me half an hour ago. I told Granny about my bad grade for that test, and she, just as I thought from the very beginning, said that we'd study a bit of math after dinner. And then she just, as a matter of fact, began telling me how earlier that day, while she was cleaning the house, she accidentally broke a vase, and she even joked that my mom was going to kill her for that. Everything seemed really strange. For some reason, I didn't tell Granny about what was going on, but I had heard about different mental diseases that elderly people often develop. So later that day, after my mom had already gotten home, I tried to talk to her about it, but she didn't believe me. She said there was no chance that Granny would throw something at me on purpose, and I probably just overreacted or imagined something that wasn't there. There was one thing about me you probably should know. I have a very vivid imagination, and when I was little, my parents even took me to a special doctor. They were afraid because I was talking about things that never existed, or in other words, I was lying a lot. Like, I had an imaginary friend and forced my family to talk to him and act as if he really existed. I don't know, for me it was just a game. But they thought that I was a bit nutty, I guess. After a couple of sessions with that doctor, I kind of stopped playing my games that way. But nobody ever forgot how inventive I could be. Anyway, time passed and no more stuff like that happened to my granny during the next couple of months. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking over that day and tried to read different stuff about dementia and other mental disorders on the internet. At first, I felt a bit nervous staying with Granny on my own, so mostly I tried to escape her whenever I could, saying that I wanted to read something or to chat with my friends on the internet, and she seemed to not suspect anything strange. But then one day, or rather one night, my parents announced that they were going to visit their friends and would probably get back home really late. It was already very late, and I was lying in bed with my iPad watching some stuff on YouTube when Granny entered my room. She was very irritated and said that I was too loud with my videos and that I was keeping her from falling asleep. I tried to protest because usually on the weekends, my parents let me stay awake until 11 p.m. Besides, Granny's bedroom was far enough from mine that she shouldn't be able to hear anything. But suddenly, she rushed at me and pulled the gadget out of my hands. She didn't manage to switch it off and got even angrier because of that. She grabbed the closest pillow to her and swung it at me, at the same time screaming that I should have apologized, rather than try to argue with her. I got so scared that all I could do was to cover my head with a blanket. I felt the pillow forcefully fall on my legs. Of course it didn't hurt me, but I started to cry. I knew that no one would believe me again. And I didn't know how to get out of this situation. But right at that moment, I heard the door downstairs open and close, which actually meant that my parents had returned home, so I started to call them for help. I don't know what exactly happened next, because I was still hiding under the blanket, but judging upon what I heard, my dad was trying to calm Granny down and took her out of my room. Meanwhile, Mom rushed at me and began hugging me, saying how sorry she was for not believing me before. I kept crying hard, but now, knowing that I finally had my parents' support, I felt relieved. I was hoping that they could take Granny to the doctor or do something else to make her go back to normal again. The next day, my mom and dad took Granny to the hospital. And when they got back home, Granny rushed to me and said how sorry she was for having scared me that much. This time, she looked sick and kinda lost. My parents were arguing over what the doctor said. As far as I understood, there were two options to deal with Granny's whatever diagnosis she had. We could either place her in a specific clinic, or we could keep her with us, under one condition, that there will be somebody to look after her. It turned out that she could no longer stay on her own. Of course, Dad didn't even want to consider, as he put it, getting rid of his mom at the first opportunity. Since then, my mom had to switch to remote work and stayed at home with Granny and me. I really tried to be as helpful as possible, but apparently the medicine that the doctor prescribed to Granny didn't work. Her health condition got worse. I mean, the mental one. She no longer smiled and was rude most of the time. Actually, whenever she saw me, she would even begin swearing hard so that my mom would immediately find me something else to do, rather than staying with Granny in the same room. And also, my parents were fighting all the time. I heard them arguing in their bedroom, and whenever we were all together, they barely talked to each other. I don't know, I was afraid that they would get divorced, so I tried not to talk about my granny's rants. For example, when she once purposely doused me with hot tea, I told Mom that I just awkwardly spilled it on myself. I just know that whenever Granny did something bad to me, Mom would get angry with Dad and they would fight again. And then one day, we just couldn't find Granny anywhere. Can you imagine our feelings when she was just gone? At first, Mom and I looked for Granny all over the house. You know, you can never really understand what might pop into the mind of a sick person, right? She could have literally locked herself in a closet. Dad was at work back then, and Mom got terribly afraid that if something bad happened to Granny on her watch, he would never forgive her. By the way, it was then when we figured out why Granny didn't feel better from the pills. She was literally hiding them under the bed, instead of taking them. Then Mom called the police, and just in case, we went to check the neighborhood on our own. We found her 5 blocks from our home. She was eating something from a garbage can. Miraculously, we persuaded her to go home, and all the way she swore at us and screamed that we were kidnapping her. Everyone around us was looking at us. It was terrible. But things got even worse when my dad came home and found out about everything. This was just what Mom was afraid of. He began accusing her of everything. I think it was the last straw for Mom's patience. She said that if he didn't take Grandma to a special nursing home, she'd take me and leave him. I don't think I'd be telling the story if my dad chose us, but he didn't. The very next day, my mom and I moved to a motel at first, and after approximately a week, she rented a tiny apartment for us. And after 6 months more, of course, my mom and I went to the funeral ceremony, but she and Dad still got divorced. I can't believe that if my mom had been patient for another 6 months, our family would still be together. And I just can't get rid of the thought that everything happened because of me. Because it was an attempt to protect me from the attacks of my granny that my mother packed our things back then. Did you like my story, guys? Then click the like button. And also feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below this video. Bye!